Hello, thank you for purchasing Tame Pain's newest template, the Blueprint. I am Dr. Michael Ray. I am the founder of Tame Pain and created this most recent template. This is a video tutorial on how to use the spreadsheet itself. If you need additional guidance, please be sure to refer to the PDF that you should have received with your purchase. That is also a written walkthrough guide for utilizing this template and provides some pretty pertinent information on pain education and understanding for progressing through this template. So let's get into this. When you load the template, you're going to see the welcome page. You can put in your name, or if you're a clinician working with someone else, you can put their name there as well as their email because you can share this with them. Point number one you're going to see is an introductory video that will be this video. If you struggle to find the link, then you can click on that and it will take you to the Blueprint video. Be sure to look over the PDF, and then when you're using the drop-down cells on the exercise selection tab, just make sure you're selecting the right movements that you want for that particular phase. We did preload this out, just generally speaking, of how we expect progressions to go from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, but many people may need to alter that based off of where they're at, their pain tolerance levels, their prior activity levels, and equipment availability. So don't be afraid to make changes. This is a template, so it's just simply a general guide to take you from where you're at to start making moves figuratively and literally towards your goals that you have related to activity and help overcome chronic pain issues. When you click the second tab, you're going to have the calculator. So if you are familiar with physical activity, maybe previously, and specifically doing resistance training, then you can utilize this calculator to help you pick loads for activity. I encourage you, though, that the primary driver of the loads you're selecting, whether it's body weight against gravity or some other type of resistance, then try to use rate of perceived exertion. The PDF guide goes through it in great detail to help you kind of make those decisions about, am I ready to move forward in a phase? Do I need to select a heavier load or lighter load based on how I'm feeling? The caveat that I will mention in this walkthrough is with rate of perceived exertion, we usually talk about it as a difficulty or fatigue metric, just trying to quantify how someone's feeling with the activity. But don't forget, in this context and with this template, if you're dealing with chronic pain, then to layer in your pain experience into the rate of perceived exertion. That will likely be the limiting variable when you're rating the perceived exertion, especially in phase 1 and potentially phase 2 of the template. So don't feel as though, my pain is increasing in the activity, but I'm not really feeling that fatigued. That's okay. You could still use an RPE, say 7, to account for your pain experience over your difficulty and fatigue experience. Don't worry about dashboard analysis until you start logging some information. Once you start logging, you're going to see on this analysis page that we have plotted out trends for you so you can track it, or you can track your client's improvement over time. And so there's various exercise slots that will get populated here, and then as well as rate of perceived exertion down here. So this is taking a weekly average of session RPE. At the end of each session, you will rate the difficulty of the session on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 being the easiest activity you've ever done, basically sitting on the couch. 10 being the hardest activity you've ever completed. And there's really no way you could complete it same day, much less tomorrow either. And so we can track that and see. I usually don't like having folks go into RPEs 8s, 9s, and 10s as a weekly average for their session RPE. It's okay to go there sometimes, but shouldn't be the norm. A new addition to this particular template are the aerobic metrics. And so you'll see this down here in the bottom right-hand corner. And we're going to track various things. Now, you can pick what your aerobic activity is if you want it to be walking, if you want it to be jogging, cycling, swimming, whatever it is. We're going to track the distance that you travel for that aerobic activity, as well as the duration of the activity and the specific session RPE to that activity. One of the major goals of this template is to help folks who haven't been physically active to start activity, to begin the path towards meeting physical activity guidelines ideally. But it's not something we want to rush someone who's been sedentary from that point of sedentary to immediately meeting those guidelines. Those guidelines are quite simply aerobic activity for 150 to 300 minutes per week at moderate intensity, or 75 to 150 minutes per week at vigorous intensity, or some combination thereof. For context, we're using rate of perceived exertion to help dictate that intensity qualifier. And then resistance training for 2 days a week for all major muscle groups. So our goal is that we assume the starting point to be sedentary, no prior activity in the past several weeks and months. And we're going to slowly increase those activity levels, frequency, volume, and intensity over time from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. So this analysis tab will be quite handy because you can kind of track your progress, myself included. I like to be able to see that and see, am I going in a direction that I want to, or do we need to make changes? The overview tab ultimately just lays out what is going to happen from week to week with each activity. So it will show the progressions of the exercise, so exercise selection itself that we pre-filled out for you. And then we'll also show how sets, reps, and RPE change from not only phase to phase, but week to week as well. When you go to phase 1 exercise selection, you're going to see a couple of columns. You have aerobics, squat movement, press movement, and then deadlift movement. And then you also have some sub-columns down here for front of the arm movements, back of the arm movements, as well as quote unquote core movements. The goal here is just simply to go from not doing resistance training to start resistance training. And oftentimes in these scenarios, I'm human too, with many different tasks kind of pulling my attention. And so we really wanted to maximize how long or how much time would someone need to spend to implement meeting the resistance training guidelines over the time frame of this template. And so really just large muscle group, multi-jointed movements seems to be the way to go. We can do a squat movement, a press movement, and kind of a hip hinging or deadlift movement and cover a lot of ground with hitting all major muscle groups and shortening the amount of time we need to spend in the gym or at home, focusing on the activity. So you're going to see here a couple of kind of breakouts for aerobics. So for day 1, whichever day you want that to be, whether that's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, it's totally up to you, whatever works for your schedule. You can click the drop-down menu and pick whatever aerobic activity you want to utilize. I encourage folks who haven't been doing any activity, if walking is feasible, start with walking. You could also get on a cycle ergometer or a recumbent bike or an upright bike and use that. Similarly with rowing on, say, a Concept 2 rower. Those are tangible starting points for folks. Don't feel like you have to start running. And then, so that will be your day 1. On a different day, on day 2, whether that's the next day or maybe you need a recovery day after that, day 2, we're going to pick those movements that we want to do. So for a lot of folks, it's going to be perfectly okay to start with a sit-to-stand, where you're just trying to lower down to a chair under your own volitional control and stand back up. On day 2, we have, the next movement we have for day 2 is an upper body press movement, which is going to be a modified push-up if you need it. So from that kneeling position, and then just lowering your chest down to the ground and then pressing back out. And you may want to start with the body weight good morning as your deadlift, which is in essence, kind of think of it as like bowing, bending over, and standing back up. Each of these are purposefully a starting point in which we hope to be able to make gains over the subsequent weeks and progressing these activities. You can see day 3 is also going to be aerobic activity. And again, I would encourage you, if you need to start with with walking or some other activity that you find is acceptable as your starting point. And then day 4 will be that second day of resistance training with the same movement. We're going to use the same movements to give you a chance to adapt to that in the subsequent weeks before we really progress those. The last thing for this phase, you're going to see the accessory movements, as we will call them. These are not by any means a must. If you have the available equipment and time, please feel free to layer in front of arm movement, back of arm movements. Most of these are going to require some equipment, so some way to load the biceps. Maybe it's a soup can in the beginning stages if you don't have dumbbells. And then similarly with back of the arm movements, if you're going to do a tricep kickback, you could use that soup can and kick back as well. And then core movements, you don't typically need much equipment to do these, so you could start with curl ups, which would be perfectly okay. Once you go through phase one exercise selection tab, you pick all of your movements that are a good starting point for you and your prior activity history and what you feel capable of, especially if you're on your own and not using this with a clinician, and that you have available equipment and time to do. Then we can click over to week one. You can see all the movements you selected are then going to populate on week one. So we'll go up here to week one, day one. We have our walking. I don't have it preset for how long it should take you. Now, I talk about it in the walkthrough guide. I mean, it may be 5 minutes for some folks, it may be 15 minutes, but ideally trying to keep that session RPE fairly lower, around a 7 or less even. It's totally okay. We're just trying to start somewhere and start moving over time. So don't feel like you have to go out of the gate and do 30 minutes on day one. That's not what we're asking. Remember, especially if you're dealing with pain, that may be the limiting variable at this time, but that's okay. It won't always be that way. We'll build some capacity over the subsequent weeks for these activities. When you go to day two for that first resistance training day, you can see there's the sit to stand. We have pretty broad range of repetitions allowable, and that was very purposeful. I wanted folks to be able to adjust the dosage of activity from an intensity perspective for rate of perceived exertion by adjusting the repetitions or the load, which could be in this context body weight, or if you're feeling capable progressing to a goblet squat, you could change the load that you're holding during the goblet squat while also changing the repetitions. So we have two ways with which we can adjust accordingly to our needs to meet that rate of perceived exertion. So that's why you see 5 to 15 reps at RPE 4. Should be pretty simple, kind of a warm up, so to speak, set. And then 5 to 15 reps at RPE 5, 5 to 15 reps at RPE 6. You're going to make that adjustment of the repetitions because it's a sit to stand, it's just body weight. You're going to adjust the repetitions only to meet the RPE. So if you did 10 sit to stands for your first set and you put that in an RPE 4, we know that we could take that up a little bit higher in repetitions. Maybe we take it to 12 and you're at an RPE 5, and then 14 and you're at an RPE 6 for that next set. Don't forget to rest between these sets. So you would do that number of repetitions, rest, and then do more repetitions. The rest is there to just allow for some recovery from a bioenergetic standpoint so you can reproduce the necessary substrates to put through energy pathways to produce ATP. In other words, to have the energy you need to do the set again. So take that rest break. It's needed. And then you're going to see that for each other exercise that populated in this context for day one, modified push-up, body weight good morning. And then if you have time, we have the supplemental exercises populated over here as well. So you can kind of take a look at that. When you go to week two, it's going to be a repeat for the most part, but you're going to see an uptick on the RPE. So we increase that to RPE 7. Week three, it's still going to be at RPE 7. If you're going through phase one, don't be afraid to progress the exercise. So if we go back to phase one exercise selection, and you found week one was a little too easy than you expected, like most of your session RPEs were at like 4 or 5, then feel free to go over here to squat for day two and change it to body weight squat, where you're not doing the sit to stand, so you don't have that depth cue. You're now just doing a body weight squat up and down. If you were starting it there and that felt too easy, you can go to a goblet squat. If you were starting there and that felt too easy, then we can go to a barbell back squat, so on and so forth. So you have that freedom to progress the exercises as you feel ready or your clinician you're working with feels ready. Phase two, there's not much difference here. We're just layering in more frequency in order to bring up meeting those physical activity guidelines. So you can see now you have 3 days of aerobics instead of just 2, but we're keeping the resistance training movements the same, but our 2 days a week at the frequency. But our expectation is you've progressed those exercises. And then when you get to the week 4, you're going to notice repetitions are changing. So now instead of it's 5 to 15, we're giving it 8 to 12 at RPE 7. Week to 5 is going to take you up to RPE 7 as well. And then week 6, you're going to see a back off set at RPE 7. So RPE 7 times 2 sets. Now that doesn't mean you have to do the same weight for both sets. You may need to go up to keep an RPE 7, or you may need to go down, or you can stay the same. Don't be afraid to kind of explore that. And then week 7 is going to match week 6. When we get to phase 3, this is really where we're trying to make that final push to meet physical activity guidelines. So you now see 4 days of aerobic activity and 2 days of resistance training. We may in the future do a template add-on to add in a third day of resistance training, but we really wanted to focus on that 2 days a week for all major muscle groups and meeting the volume requirement for aerobic activity as well. So that's why you're going to see a preference towards aerobic activity and then the 2 days a week of resistance training. Once you pick your exercise selection, adjust them accordingly based on what you saw in phase 2. Then you can go to week 8. And now we're going to see with week 8, the repetitions change again. We're now down to 6 to 10 repetitions, and we have up to RPE 7. Week 9 is going to be 2 sets of RPE 7. Week 10 is going to be up to an RPE 8. That's the first time we've brought in an RPE 8. So we're really letting folks start to push that intensity as volume is likely going down. Keep in mind, volume and intensity, they're inversely related. So if intensity is going up, volume has to go down. And if volume is going up, intensity has to go down. However, we're measuring those two based on modes of activity. So week 11 is then going to see still sustaining at that RPE 8. And then week 12, we're going to have an increase in volume going up to 2 sets at RPE 8. And that's the template. That's 12 weeks. It should be more than sufficient to go from not being very physically active or completely sedentary to titrating up our activity for aerobic activity as well as resistance training, and doing it in a manner that's kind of with logical and purposeful progressions while still affording you or your clinician or your collaboration together autonomy to change exercise selection and repetition and loads to meet this rate of perceived exertion so you can kind of auto-regulate through the template. So don't feel like you're locked in. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to email us at contact@tamepain.com. You can also go to tamepain.com and go click on the forums tab and start a thread where we can track along with your progress and provide feedback and community support as needed. Thanks again for trusting us with your needs in relationship to physical activity and education on chronic pain.